Is that better? All right. We're going to be in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, we're going to start reading from verse 16. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein," in other words, in the gospel of Christ, "is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them." Today I want to talk about these three signs that God points out to us, that Paul points out to us in Romans 1, to try to alert us, to warn us, to teach us if we need to make some changes in our life, especially if you're here today and you're not saved, you should pay attention to this. Paul says that there are things that are revealed in the gospel of God of Christ. The first one he mentions, we saw in Romans, the first verse, verse 16, is that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. It is one of the things that tells us that we are wrong. It's hard sometimes to know if you're wrong. It really is hard. In fact, this morning, the Sunday school in the auditorium was about epistemology, which is how to know that what you know is true. Because that's a very difficult thing. Because you would think, well, I know it. Of course it's true. I know it. But you've known a lot of things that haven't been true. You still know a lot of things that are not true. And we're going to find out as time progresses in our life, as they discover new things, as they understand new things, we're going to find out that many things that we always knew were true are not true at all. So we're in constant contention with that in our mind, constantly battling in our mind whether or not the things that we know to be true really are true. And so then the question is, how do we know what's true? And because it's hard to know what's true. It's hard to know if you are good or bad or right or wrong when you live in a world where everyone's the same. Because one way in which you can know whether or not what you are or do or think or say is good or bad, right or wrong, is by comparing it. Really, that's the only way we can do that. We have to compare it to something. Because obviously, if I thought it was wrong, I wouldn't do it. For the most part. I mean, I know we do things we know are wrong, and that's easy. But what about the things we don't know if they're right or wrong? How do we know? Well, obviously, if we thought it was wrong, look, if you said, well, what is it you know that isn't true? Well, if I knew, it wouldn't be a problem anymore. I'm not like setting out to know things that are false. My intention is to know things that are true. My intention is to do what's right. My intention, right, is to be right. But how do I know if I'm right? How do you know if you're right? Well, you have to compare yourself. But everyone you compare yourself to is the same. Minor differences between people. It's not like there's somebody out there that is so much better. They are incrementally better or incrementally worse. And really, a lot of times we're just trading places on what's good and bad. So how do you know? Well, we got to compare ourselves to something. Now, Paul says is that in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the righteousness of God is revealed. And when we compare to the righteousness of God, then we can know where we stand. That is a very clear, very strong testimony to what is right and what is wrong. The problem is that too many of us are unfamiliar with, ignorant of the righteousness of God. Even as Christians. I mean, how many times do we use the excuse, well, everybody does it? As if that means anything. In fact, as Christians, we should understand that that is more of an accusation than an excuse. Right? A Christian should know that when he says everybody does it, that's essentially admitting you're wrong. Because you should not be doing what everybody is doing. If everybody's doing it, it is almost for sure wrong. But that just shows that we are much more familiar with what everybody is doing than what God's righteousness is. But what Paul says is that by understanding the righteousness of God, we can understand some very important truths. A lot of times we think, right, that the people going to hell are all the worst people. Just terrible, horrible people go to hell. And that is true. Terrible, horrible people do go to hell. There's no doubt about that. But they're not the only ones who go to hell. Path to hell probably looks a little bit more like that. People go to hell not because they're the worst in humanity, but because they don't measure up to the righteousness of God. God is not judging people based on how they compare to other people. That's not how judgment works. God is not looking at your life saying your life is not too bad because next to your neighbor you look good. That's not how it works. God is saying this is the rule of righteousness. This is the standard that you have to achieve. I accept nothing less. Nothing less. It doesn't matter if you're a little better or a little worse or a little different than anybody else. What matters is how do you compare next to the righteousness of God. Now, we have several quasi ways of determining what that righteousness is. They're like abstractions of that righteousness. They're models or prototypes of it. For instance, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, they're not the righteousness of God, but they're a really good approximation of what it could look like. Now, they are far from it. Far from it. Jesus made that clear in Matthew chapter 5, right? They are far from the actual righteousness of God. They are just some rules written in stone, but they're a really good place to start off with. So what does God's righteousness look like? Well, you can start at the Ten Commandments and get a really good idea of what they would look like. And get a good starting point right there, right? And then you can move on and you can read more about the law and the law of Moses. Get a little better idea of what it's starting to look like. And then you can get into Jesus, into Paul, into the other writers of the New Testament and get a much better idea of what God's righteousness looks like. And as you learn more about His righteousness, you'll find out He's righteous and you are not. You'll not only find out what His righteousness looks like, you find out what your unrighteousness looks like. Right? Because you get compared. That's why we don't, I had a friend a family member who was pretty good at sports. And he was on this football team, like a flag football team or whatever, and he's the quarterback. Well, they had a guy join the team who was actually a pro football player at one point. He was retired now. But, he was still worlds better than anyone else, even retired. Well, that guy didn't want him ever to be quarterback because he didn't want to look bad. Right? You don't want to play, we want to be within our weight class. Right? That's where we want. We want to punch in our weight class. We don't want to go up against people who are really better than us because we look bad. That's why we like to hang around friends that are of our basic level, right? I mean, a guy doesn't want to go hang around another guy who's like, he's a 10 and you're a 5. No one's ever going to date you. I know. You want to hang around the 4s, right? You know who I'm looking at back there. You want to kind of fit in. You don't want to, get around someone who's that much better at something than you. It's why at work, they're always telling employees when you get a new employee comes into work, they're going to show the boss that they're good and they want to make more money, so they're working real hard, and everyone says, "Hey, slow down. You don't need to be making everyone look bad. That's just all work the same. Nobody wants to hang around somebody who makes everyone else look bad." Some of you are saying, "No wonder I have no friends." No, that's not why. You don't have any friends, but that's not why. What does Paul say in Romans chapter 3, verse 9? What then? Are we better than they? He's talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. That's how Romans starts off with, comparison between Jews and Gentiles. And it's very comical, but we won't get into that. But anyways, he says, so then what then? This is kind of his conclusion. So what are we saying then? Are we saying that Jews are better than Gentiles? Absolutely not. For we have already proved that both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. Yeah, okay, so Jews have a little bit better here, and the Gentiles are a little bit better there, and they're a little different here than there, and there's these things. But you know what we look at? We stand back and we see, what do we see? We see this whole mass of people, and they're all under sin. And how do we know that? Because we can look at the righteousness of God, and then we look at ourselves in the mirror, and we say, okay, I don't know exactly where I'm wrong, but I know I'm wrong, because I don't look anything like that. And that really is the problem, right? That we just don't really know where we're wrong. And that's hard to know sometimes exactly. But when we understand the righteousness of God, then we look at ourselves, even if we can't identify what's wrong with that picture, it's obvious that is not the same. I don't know if you've ever, some of you are good artists. I'm not a good artist. I've tried to be. So I take a little, a picture that someone has drawn, and then I try to draw it. And I don't know why it doesn't turn out the same. But when I compare them, there's no doubt they are not the same. Now, when I don't look at theirs and only look at mine, well, then it's like when you look at your own kid, you think he's beautiful. Everyone else knows he's not. It's like, oh, that did come out pretty good. But then when I put it next to each other, it's like, okay, that's not very good at all. That's real bad. I don't know what happened there. I can't tell you why it's bad, but it's bad. That's how it is when we stand next to the righteousness of God at first. It's not like you can go through a list and say, okay, these are the places I need to fix. You're not even aware of that is how corrupt we are, right? That you want to know how corrupt we are? We are so corrupt that we actually think the Ten Commandments are the righteousness of God. Yeah. And we think that's really hard. That's how corrupt we are. Because they're not hard, and they're not the righteousness of God. They should be simple. That's how corrupt we are. And so when we look at the righteousness of God, it reveals that to us. It also tells us what we can be. This isn't just about condemnation. When God reveals His righteousness, this isn't just about Him saying, I'm better than you. You'll never be like me. As hard as you try, you can look at me and you see you're so horrible. That's not what it's about. It's about God saying it's an offer of righteousness. Yes. This is the righteousness that I want to give you. This is why I cannot accept your righteousness. Because that is too little. I will not accept that for you. You need this righteousness. This isn't God saying, unless you can achieve this on your own, then you're going to hell. This is God saying, this is the only righteousness that I accept. And so I'm giving it to you. I'm giving it to you. Because no less is sufficient. That's how it is revealed to us in the gospel. The gospel does not reveal a righteousness that's unattainable. It reveals a righteousness that is unworkable. We cannot achieve it of our own. But we can attain it through faith. And that's what Paul explains after that in Romans, right? He gets into there and he says, look, Abraham was not a righteous man, but he attained perfect righteousness. How? It wasn't by the law. It certainly wasn't by the Ten Commandments. They had not even been given. So how did Abraham, without the law, without the Ten Commandments, without anything the Jews had, he had nothing. He didn't even have the land. He had nothing. How did Abraham achieve righteousness or attain to righteousness without those things? By faith. It says he believed and God counted his faith for righteousness. God gave him that righteousness. So how righteous was Abraham? As righteous as God. Because that's the righteousness he had. He had God's righteousness. So Abraham wasn't a little better than you. He was just like you. And yet he was righteous. So when we look at that and we look at that righteousness, then we should think, well, If Abraham can be righteous, and Jacob can be righteous, and Peter can be righteous, and all of these people who we know could never have achieved it of their own, they're all righteous, then I can be righteous too. I don't have to go to hell. It's true. I cannot, of my own accord, achieve it. If it's up to me, if it's up to me doing it, if it's up to me accomplishing it, then I cannot. But if there is an offer to give it to me, then I can. And you can. It says of the Jews, he says that they were being ignorant of God's righteousness. They went about to establish their own righteousness. And because of that, they have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Now, this is what you have to understand about what God has revealed about His righteousness. You can't have both. You cannot try to achieve your own righteousness through being a good person, or through the keeping of the law, or through the keeping of the Ten Commandments, or whatever other way you think you might achieve righteousness. If you are going to set up your own righteousness, you reject the righteousness of God. That's right. And if you want the righteousness of God, you have to reject your own righteousness. So when we say that you're saved by faith, not of works, we don't mean faith first, or faith foremost, or almost all faith. It is a rejection of works. It is a rejection of the keeping of the law. It's not an addition to. You can't do both. Now people say, well, if you're rejecting works in the law, then you're saying that it's okay to sin. You have not understood God's righteousness then. You have not understood it. Because again, the law is not God's righteousness. And the keeping of the law is not God's righteousness. It's not even close to it. Not even close. The only way you receive God's righteousness is not of the law, not of works, not of merit. You have to reject those things. You have to accept only a righteousness that is a gift without merit, that has nothing at all to do with works, everything to do with faith. And what you receive is not just forgiveness. We're not talking about forgiveness. That's something else. We're talking about you receive righteousness. And Paul says in Romans 10, the problem with the Jewish people is they were ignorant of God's righteousness. Now that's very interesting. That of all the people on earth that Paul would say were ignorant of God's righteousness, it would be the Jews, but that's what he says. They were ignorant of God's righteousness. They tried to establish their own righteousness, and because of that, they ended up with none. Because they did not submit themselves. So one of the things that we ought to look at, and you should be considering right now today, is the righteousness of God. What is the righteousness of God? It is the continual, unending, never-changing ability to do good. That's what it is. We talk about how there's good people and bad people. There's actually no good people. There really aren't. I understand in the vernacular there are good people and bad people. But I'm telling you that in an absolute sense, there are no good people. What does it mean to be a good person? It means you never do anything wrong, one, but that's really not it. It means you always do everything good. Right? Because that's what it says. If you know to do good and you don't do it, that's sin. So being good is not just refraining from doing bad. You white-knuckle, right, your life, and you keep yourself from doing wrong, and you think, well, I'm a good person because I didn't do anything bad. But you didn't do anything good. Good people do good things all the time, every time, without fail. If that's not you, you're not good. That's why it says there is none good but God. That's what Jesus said. That is the highest virtue there is to be good. That's righteousness. Are you righteous? You always, every time, No matter what, don't just stop, don't do bad, but you actively go out of your way to do good. No. No, in fact, you seldomly do. You'll do good when it's convenient. You'll do good when it's comfortable. You'll do good when you realize it can be done and it's okay to do. It's not going to hurt you too bad. You'll do good. And that's fine. That's nice. Makes you a good human being. It does not make you righteous. We have to consider the righteousness of God. Another thing we should consider, he says in Romans 1:17, is that the gospel reveals the wrath of God. It's not popular. It's not what you're going to hear. A lot of times, a lot of places, people want to talk about a God that is love, and that is certainly a true thing. God is love. But this is the complexity of God. God has wrath. God does not tolerate unrighteousness. Now, you might think, when you personalize it, you don't want to think about it that way. But how about we just put a little more abstract and we consider it for a moment? How could God not have wrath when you consider the wickedness that is in the world? However you want to define it. Let's just start there. Whatever you define as being the worst sin, just think right now in your mind, what is the very worst sin somebody could commit? Whatever you want to define that to be. Are there people that do that? Absolutely. Lots of them. And do they get away with it? Most of them. Most of them. Well, if there is a God, how can that be? If there is a God, and God is love, doesn't He love the victims of that sin? Whatever it is, the sin you had in your mind, that is the worst sin for you, that sin has victims. Somebody suffered at the hand of that sin. Doesn't God love them? How can there be no justice? How can there be no wrath? How can there be no punishment for the worst sin in the world? How is that possible? Well, the Bible's answer is, it's not possible. There is going to be a judgment. There is going to be wrath. God does love the victims. In the Old Testament, at the end of the Old Testament, God comes and speaks to the priests and the religious leaders, and He condemns them. You know why? Because they treated their wives poorly. And I don't mean that they, talked ugly to them. I mean, when they got old and wrinkled, or they weren't fun no more, they went and got another one. And God says, I judge the cause of those women. They're being victimized, and nobody cares. I care. And I won't put up with it. I will not put up with it. And He says, and when you pray, I don't hear what you have to say. Now, just know this, that while you, a minute ago, were thinking about the worst sin in your mind, and you're thinking about other people, somebody in this room was probably thinking about what you do. And that, what you do, was what they consider to be the worst sin. This is why God's wrath is also on you. Because every sin has a victim. See, a thief doesn't think thievery is that bad, because he's benefiting from it. But the guy who gets stolen from, they think it's terrible, even if they're also thieves. It's like thieves get more mad about thievery than anyone else. Like, how dare they steal from me what I rightly stole from somebody else? What you need to understand about God's wrath is that it is inevitable. There is no way you're going to avoid this. There is no logical world in which God does not avenge sin. There is no logical way around this. If you're going to have any logical understanding whatsoever, if you're going to look at this critically in any way, you are going to come to the conclusion that if God does nothing else in history, He is going to make things right. He may not build a big city of gold. He may not answer all your prayers. He may not give you everything you want. But this one thing, logically, you should know God will do. There is no doubt. He will make things right. Everybody who has suffered at the hand of a sinner will be avenged. Everybody who has made someone to suffer at the hand of sin will suffer the wrath of God. Otherwise, there is no God. It is an inevitable fact. This is what God is revealing through the gospel. And we go through the gospel, we find this. In fact, Peter says, look, all we have to do is look around us and realize that this is true. You know, we think about, you hear, and sometimes it's a little humorous to me sometimes to hear people, Christians, talk about, well, you know God's here because look at the wonderful creation. They look around the world. Look at the world. Look at all these things. Amazing things. The world we live in today is not a product of creation. God created the world. But what you're looking at is not creation. It is destruction. This is not what the world looked like. God flooded the world. When you go to the Grand Canyon, that's not creation. That's destruction. That is an enormous, unfathomably large amount of water rushing across what we now know as the United States and ripping billions of tons of rock and trees and animals and everything in its path, ripping it out and hauling it out to the sea and leaving a gaping hole there. It's like looking at someone who's got a scar across their face, they're missing an eye, their ears cut off and saying, wow, God made you beautifully. No, this is not God's handiwork. I got kidnapped and this is what's happened. Sin brought upon God's wrath. God flooded the world, the entire world. And when you go to the Exxon or the Valero and you put that thing in your tank and start pumping it, that is the dead bodies that got buried by the wrath of God. You don't know you know why they call them fossil fuels? That is, you tell me, you know how much oil we are pumping every day out of the ground? Pumping out of the ground? Billions of barrels. You know how many living creatures it takes to make a barrel of oil? You are talking about an unfathomable amount of destruction. Peter says that anybody who believes that God is not going to judge is not looking around. Everything around us tells us not that God can create. It tells us God can destroy. It's not only inevitable, the wrath of God is imminent. There is no reason why He has not judged yet. There's nothing holding this back. There's nothing that I know you go to prophecy conferences, which I don't know why people still do, because they've always been wrong. I mean, I grew up afraid, just scared to death of 1988. That was when the Lord was coming. I wasn't going to have time to get married. I wasn't going to have time to do anything I wanted to do. It's like, oh, I don't know why I bother try. It's already 86, 2 more years. They were wrong. And then some other crop of prophets came out. It's 1989, 1990, the year 2000. I mean, we're all scared. Y2K. Oh, no. The Mayan calendar, 2001. It's like, they're always wrong. Always wrong. And they always say, He can't come back yet because of, no, not true. God's judgment is imminent. Jesus said a very interesting thing. He said, they wanted to kill Him. And Jesus told them, you can't. It's not my time. But it's always your time. Oh, I love that. He says, you can't kill me, it's not my time. But you just hear it. I wish it was audible. I wish we had the audio version, right? Where he just looks at him and just deep, piercing eyes. But it's always your time. Oh, never mind. We're going to go stand somewhere else. I don't know what that meant. That is what I'm telling you. You think, well, I just don't think the world's going to end. it's going to end for you real soon. It might end for you today. And what difference does it make if it ends for me or not? I mean, really. You say, Christians, they're wrong. They say the world's going to end. You're going to go out and get in your car. You're going to drive out onto Walzem. And sooner or later, somebody's going to T-bone you and you're going to die and the world is going to end for you. That's right. Because your time is always nigh. Yeah, that's right. But you really think you have some guarantee of tomorrow? And when you die, the Bible says clearly you will stand before God and be judged. That's right. By that rule of righteousness we already talked about. And you tell me what God's response will be to somebody who did not submit to his righteousness, but preferred to set up their own set of own brand of it. What do you think God's response will be? If you design something that could save humanity, if you designed a cure for cancer, and then somebody didn't want to accept yours, so they made a knockoff version that didn't actually save anybody, and you could pass judgment on that, what would your judgment be? Well, that's what you're doing. You have a knockoff form of righteousness that doesn't actually make anybody righteous. And what do you think God's judgment is going to be on that? Paul says in Romans that God was willing to, who is willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, hath endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction. How do we know of God's wrath, what it really is? First off, it's not that God is angry. And he's not mad. That's too little. That's to belittle it. It's like God's throwing a tantrum. No, that's not what it is. Just like righteousness was not these tablets of stone and these little words carved on them. That's not righteousness. And wrath isn't that God's mad and he's going to pound people. He's going to squish them like ants or burn them like bacon. I don't know what people use, but that's not it at all. This is how Paul describes God's wrath. God's wrath is seething, patient, all in due time. You know what Peter says? Peter says people are walking around saying, where's the promise of his coming? Christians keep talking about all this. God's coming. God's judging. Nothing's happening. You don't understand. That is God's wrath. Allowing people to continue going deeper and deeper into sin, into doubt, into disbelief, into rebellion, into corruption, to a time when your sin is full and he calls you to judgment, not with a little bit, but a full plate. And then you'll understand that that was God's wrath. Just because you don't see destruction all around you and fire falling from heaven, do not think that that means that God isn't real or he doesn't really care. God's patience should frighten you. You know, when I was a kid, I grew up under a strict code of corporal, I was going to say capital, it felt like capital, of corporal punishment. For those that don't know what that means my dad beat me like a drum. That's what that means. He believed in spare the rod, spoil the child. And so I'm the least spoiled child ever. But you know what was worse than anything for me? When we get home. No, just do it now. Just do it now. I don't want him to be looking at me all night. Just look at me going. Just when I kind of put it out of my mind, he'd remind me, just when we get home, you know what's going to happen. That's worse. You think, wow, God hasn't judged me, so it's all right. You don't understand what's going on then. That's right. God is with much long suffering, just putting up with you. Now, this also, again, has a positive side. Because of God of wrath, means that God isn't all wrath. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point of distinguishing it as anything. It would just be God. But God also has forgiveness. And it is through forgiveness that He will impute righteousness and appease His own wrath. See, you say, well, what could I do to make God not mad at me? There is nothing you can do. Everything you do, He finds offensive. Everything. You try to be good. We just read about that. You try to be good. You try to establish your own righteousness. And God says, I find that offensive. But when you believe, then God gives you His righteousness, which appeases His wrath. He makes Himself happy with you. This is why it can't be of works. It has to be of grace. There's one other thing we want to look at real quickly, and it is the knowledge of God. We have the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, the wrath of God is revealed in the gospel, the knowledge of God is revealed in the gospel. What is the knowledge of God? Well, it's knowing Him, knowing who He is. This is an amazing thing. You realize that most religions don't have any clue what God's like. No clue at all. And yet, Christianity teaches that God, who gave you the ability to speak, has spoken. Gave you the ability to write, has written. And He has given you a book, we call it the Bible, wherein He has revealed Himself to you. What is the Bible about? It is about God. It's got a few verses about you to explain some things to you, but it's about God. Who He is, what He wants, what He does, and what He is offering. You know what it tells us? It tells us that God is light. Now, we dealt with this in the Sunday school, but God is light, and in Him there's no variance. That's the song they read today, and that's the verse we actually talked about. In God, there is no shadow of turning. There's no variance. You don't have to worry about what He's thinking tomorrow, what He thought yesterday, and what He thought 1,000 years ago. He thinks today. It's the same thing. You know exactly what it is. Righteousness for Abraham is the righteousness for Paul, and it's the righteousness for you. The offer of the gospel to a murderer, to a thief, and to a liar, and to you, it's all the same. It's the same grace, the same faith, the same salvation. Because God is light. International symbol of love. God is love. That's what God is. This is what the gospel reveals to us. You know, the gospel talks about God's sublime righteousness, and it talks about His terrible wrath. But it's not because He wants you to feel little or scared. It's because He wants you to understand how great His love is that overcome terrible amounts of unrighteousness, incredible amounts of wrath, and provided a way in which you can be saved. And lastly, you need to know that God is close. Paul says that you should seek the Lord if haply you may feel after Him and find Him, though He not be far from every one of us. God is close to you. He is listening to you. You're feeling around, you're thinking, I can't find Him. And it's because you need to repent. You need to turn around. God is one step away from you right now. It's just in the opposite direction you're headed. You want to find God in your way, in your path, in your direction. He's not there. He's real close, but He's not there. He's right behind you. And you need to repent. You need to turn around. You need to acknowledge your direction's wrong, your path is wrong, and you'll find God right there. Paul says you will run into Him, and you'll find a God of love and a God of light who will count faith for righteousness and appease His own wrath. If any of you have any questions about this, we are here to talk to you, to help you. Approach us. Have a good day.